So my name is Joe Emick, and I'm an art therapist currently working at a private drug and alcohol facility here in Pennsylvania. And I'm going to tell you the story of my journey from active addiction and isolation to recovery and connection. I'll say that when I was growing up, I was a little bit mischievous. I was a lover of all things art, and though I didn't have a name for it, I was gay. My dad was not. He was cerebral, he was well-read, and a lover of baseball. He later became a senator, but he worked as an attorney, and he was kind of eccentric, and I loved him. But later on he became a judge, and I realized that he judged very well. And when I was growing up, I was small. I was made fun of a lot. I don't think I hid the fact that I was gay very well. And I got made fun of. And so I started using drugs and alcohol at age 13. And for me, when I first started using, it was magic. I could escape from the pain that I felt and the isolation. Could change the way I thought other people perceived me. When I used, I felt like I was funnier. I felt like I connected with people in ways that I couldn't if I didn't use. And for a long time, it became a go-to. It was a major coping skill. Eventually, it left me alone. It left me isolated, and it left me in a place that I wouldn't wish on anyone. On October the 24th, 2004, my family intervened on me, and it was like an explosion in the living room. I was nervous, and I kept telling myself, "You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine." I remember looking around and thinking of all of the things that I had lost. I had lost an 8-year relationship. I had lost a career in architecture. I had lost myself, used in order to make myself feel normal, and really all I felt was numb. And I remember in that intervention, my dad saying, "You're gonna have to leave today." And it was really, really scary. I kept thinking back, though I could hear his words and the words in the intervention, to something that my dad said when I first came out at 17. And he said, "If you choose this lifestyle of being gay, you're going to end up alone, and you're going to be hanging out with a bunch of addicts and alcoholics." And I didn't want that to be true. I had fought so hard in most of my life to make that not true. And there I was sitting in this intervention with my 3 sisters crying, my mom was crying. Those words kept running around in my head. And the interventionist looked at me, and she says, "Do you have any stuff here?" And of course I did. And then she said, "How are you feeling?" And I said, "I'm feeling fine. I'm feeling fine." And she said, "Why don't you go to the bathroom and do what you do best?" And that was the last time I got high. I went to rehab, and while I was in rehab, I learned that addiction is a brain disease, and it alters the way we think, and it alters the way we feel, and it alters the way we behave. It changes our perceptions, not just while you're doing the drug, but in between the times that you're doing it. It's very demanding. When I used, towards the end, I felt exactly like the 2 fine pictures that you've seen, almost like there was a mask over my head. It distorted the way I presented myself, and it distorted the way life presented to me. As part of my rehab experience, my parents joined me, and during that part, there was something that we were asked to do, which is create a family abstract portrait. This is the portrait that I created with my mom and my dad in the center, my 3 sisters around the outside with their spouses, and then this was me at the top. And one of the things that they asked us to do with the image is include addiction. And so I included addiction in my image, and that's what it looked like for me. In that moment, I realized that I could connect with my thoughts and my feelings better through the artwork than to talking to somebody else about it. And it really, really resonated for me. I ended up completing rehab and going into a sober living facility in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, I was really excited. I was thinking, I'm going to get back into architecture. My therapist at the time, however, had other ideas. And they said, why don't you get a recovery job? Because you've been in treatment for 5 months, inpatient, because I was really sick, I'm just going to own it. And you're not going to know how to manage your life, especially something as demanding as architecture, unless you get a recovery job. I had friends in recovery, and those were really, really important to me. I had started talking to my dad again, and he kept asking me questions. Why doesn't willpower work? Are you sure this is going to work? All of these questions kept coming, and I knew that he didn't understand it. I had started to understand it and was moving along in my recovery. The job that I got as my recovery job was working at the front desk at a hair salon. It was a humbling experience. It's far, far cry from architecture. On a particularly difficult Saturday, when stylists weren't showing up, we were overbooked, I was losing my noodle, basically. And at the end of the day, I got a phone call, and I saw it was from my dad. And he called me, and he said, hey, I have a question for you. And I said, sure, Dad. What's that? He's like, are you still using? And I was like, no, I'm not using. He said, are you still doing the therapy? I said, yep, still doing the therapy. And then he said something that really struck a chord, a nerve with me. He said, when are you going to get a real job? And I had done enough therapy, and I had worked through the anger with my dad during the time that I was in rehab. I realized that, you know, our parents aren't given instruction manuals for us when we're born. And we're not given instruction manuals on how to interact with them. And addiction certainly didn't help any of that. But I said to him, you know, when you say that, sometimes it makes me feel like I'm not doing enough in my recovery. And it makes me feel like maybe I'm not going to make it. But most of all, it makes me feel that I'm never going to be worthy in your eyes. And there was a long, eerie pause, and he said to me, I was just worried and concerned about you. And for the first time, I could actually hear it. I could hear the emotion in his voice. It wasn't judgmental. It wasn't caustic. He was really concerned. And I realized that most of his life, that was probably true, and it came out as judgment. And it was my misinterpretation and my use that distorted that. But he wasn't very good at emotions either. And it was a powerful moment for me. A lot of my friends in recovery could see that I was doing well. They could see it before I could see it. I eventually did get an architecture job, and I lost it in a month. It was the first architectural job that I was ever fired from. Pretty embarrassing to say, but that's another story. And they said, well, since you've got so much time on your hands, why don't you go to this retreat? And so I went to that retreat. And I was thinking about the conversation that I had had with my dad, and what all of that was like. And how I had told him so many times that I was fine. How many times that word really didn't mean what it meant. After I lost the job, my friend said, you know, how are you feeling? And I said, I'm fine. And when I was at the retreat, what I realized is that fine means effed up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. And it made a lot of sense. And while I was at that retreat, I met someone that was incredibly instrumental in changing my life. She was an art therapist, and she told me a little bit about it. And she unknowingly opened the door, and I ran right into it. The next couple of months and years looked a little bit like this. I call it juggling flaming chaos balls. Because I was doing part-time work in the daytime. I was going to psychology courses because I had a degree in architecture, not psychology. So I was taking undergraduate coursework in psychology, and at nighttime I was taking studio art courses. It was exhilarating, but it was also an interesting way to reinforce the recovery and reinforce the connections. My family started trusting me a lot more. I was telling the truth. I wasn't hiding parts of myself. And most importantly, I wasn't using. I applied to graduate school. I got accepted. And after 2.5 years, I graduated. And while I was in graduate school, I learned a lot about how you can use art in therapy. And I want to talk a little bit about that right now. Just as I said, addiction affects the brain and the way we think and feel and behave. Art also functions as an intermediary between your brain and who you are as a person. And it works on the thought level, the feeling level, and the behavioral level. I'm just going to show you some examples of that. The first one, on the right-hand side, you see Clark Kent, and on the left-hand side, you see Superman. In active addiction, I used lies, I used manipulation, and I used a shroud of secrecy to keep myself protected from other people knowing that I was using. And that's kind of like Clark Kent. He had to keep those secrets, he had to lie about who he really was, in order to keep his superhero, Superman, protected. Superman, I used in this because that cognitive defense of perfection was also what I used. In architecture, I learned if I do things perfectly, then no one questions me. And if I attempted to do things perfectly in life, no one questioned me. And it's a great way to hide active addiction. That's a cognitive kind of approach. It works both cognitively and symbolically. It's very abstract and it's on the thinking level. In terms of the affect level or the emotional level, that's kind of the mid-region of the brain. And when you look at this image, what is your reaction? For me, this is anger. This is shame. This is what it felt like to really look at my past with an unjaundiced eye. And for many people, it's scary. This is actually a mandala, and a mandala means spiritual circle, and you can kind of see the circle here. But there was a lot of paper shredding and a lot of crayon destruction when I created this. The other thing that I'll say is that same kind of thing on that affective level works as well. And in recovery, I felt connected. And this is a very different image. It's still a mandala, it's very different. This one's about joy. This is about finding myself again. This is about connecting with people, especially like my dad. Both of those images depict the way that art can work on that affective level through perceptions. The lowest is on the physical. And I could utilize clay and pound out my aggression, almost kinesthetic catharsis, getting it out just through use of the clay in a physical manner. But I could also use it to create the sensual lines of a model space, the curves of the chin, the curves of the thing. And it really did connect me back to the physical because you're actually using your hands in order to create that. All three of these levels I use as an art therapist. And they're very effective. They actually hasten the recovery process for most people because they're not just sitting around and talking, they're actually doing, feeling, thinking, and behaving differently. It's really, really important. At the end of my graduate school, I had a party that was there on campus, and my family came to it. And this is probably some of the most important part of my family that I reconnected to an active addiction. It's the main reason why I got sober. And I introduced my nieces and nephews, that's who they are, to one of my professors. And during that time of the party, about 20 minutes in, one of the professors came up to me and she whispered in my ear and she said, "There's a really creepy man playing with your nieces and nephews in the corner." And I looked over and I saw a pair of black and orange tennis shoes, fuchsia running pants, socks that had embroidered rabbits and carrots, a green windbreaker, and a tweed hat. And I said, "Yeah, don't worry about that. That's my dad." I left graduate school. I worked at NIH for a little while, and then I got the job that I currently have. And it's been an incredible experience. It's very different for me than where I thought I was going when I started this journey 13 years ago. All I wanted to do is get my family out of that intervention, go do my 30 days, and then move back where I was from. And that didn't happen at all. I never thought that I would be doing art therapy, but that's the way my recovery unfolded. There's lots of lenses that we look at life through. For me, addiction only allowed me to see through one lens. Through the process of recovery, through the process of change, through the process of being able to pursue things that I didn't realize that I could pursue, different lenses can be used at different times, just like in art therapy, whether that's on the thought processes, the feeling processes, or the behavioral processes. It's really important, and it's a really important way to kind of approach life now. And I love the experience for it. I was exhilarated in college. It was a new chapter, and it was one, again, that I didn't think was going to be possible. About 4 years ago, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. And there was a lot of things that I wanted to make sure that I said and that I did with him to make sure that there wasn't anything that was left out, because my 26 years in active addiction, my relationship with him was not that great. And so I went home where my parents lived, and my dad was in bed. He was frail, he was going blind, and he's like, "Hey Joe, what's going on?" And I said, "We need to talk." And he's like, "We're not going to be doing any more of that therapy stuff, are we?" And I said, "Well, we kind of are." And he just stopped me, and with his one good eye, he's like, "You just need to know that we're really, really good." And that was so important to me, because I realized that I had made it through something that a lot of my friends did make it through. A lot of my friends have died from this addiction. It's not fair, but it's true. My dad died 3 years ago, and I spoke at his funeral. And after the funeral was over, a fellow judge that he worked with came up to me and he said he had known my dad for about 30 years. And he said some amazing things to me. He said, "Your dad and I talked a lot, and he was really, really not fine during that intervention because he thought he was losing his son." And he said, he was really surprised when you called him from that recovery job and told him what you told him, because he could see the changes, and that surprised him. And he was never more proud than when you got your graduate degree and he was able to play with your nieces and nephews at the party. And I realized that my dad and I had a lot more in common than I ever realized. We were both kind of emotional cripples. And my recovery process helped me to reconnect with me, with my emotions, but more importantly, my family, and specifically my dad. I was watching the World Series this past month, and my dad loved baseball. He loved watching the World Series. Me, not so much. But I got emotional, and I started crying. And I realized that I miss my dad. I miss him a lot. I miss talking to him. I miss the 10 years that we had after I got sober. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. But I also realized that I wasn't fine. But when thinking about the relationship I had with my dad, I just remember those words that I did have with him. And though we were not fine for most of our lives, in the end, we were really, really good.